Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. We're just going to give it about 20 more seconds or so for others to log on, so please stay put and we'll get started. All right, we're just going to get started now. We know we have a very short time with you all, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome everyone. Again, thank you for joining today's training on Afghan history. This is the first of 5-part series on cultural and considerations for working with Afghan clients. This is a training presented to you by Switchboard, which is a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. My name is Tigis Coleman, and I'm Switchboard's training officer. I'll be your facilitator, helping our main speakers today that you'll be hearing from shortly. I'd like to mention that today's session will run just for 30 minutes and that it's going to be recorded. You'll receive an email with the recording, the slides, and the recommended resources within 24 hours. The webinar transcript, along with the recording, will also be posted on Switchboard website within the following days. Let's take some Zoom logistics. By now, most are pretty familiar with the Zoom settings, so I won't go too deep into it. I do want to note that this is a webinar, therefore you're joining on listen-only mode. You may switch your audio between your computer and your phone at any time under your audio settings that is located in the lower left corner of your screen. Due to the very large size of the webinar today, we might disable the chat as needed if it's too distracting. So please keep an eye out on the chat for messages from Switchboard, but hopefully we'll leave it on, but if it gets a little distractive, we might turn it off. Again, the chat is available for you. And of course, the Q&A is another function that I want to mention, which you can use to type any questions. You can click the thumbs up to vote for another participant's question, which will kind of bump it up so that we can see it. We also have reviewed, I know, some of the questions that you've submitted, and we hope to have covered that in the training. Finally, you have the option to turn on the automated closed captioning on today's webinar, and to do so, you can click the CC or the live transcript. You may choose subtitles or the full transcript, and also just to keep in mind that the closed captioning for today's webinar is automated and it may not be completely accurate following the webinar. So please keep an eye out for the full edited transcript. That might be helpful for some that might need it. With that, I am thrilled to be introducing you to our speakers today. We have Dr. Farid Saydee, who is a professor at the School of Curriculum and Teaching at Kean University. Professor Said is also the founder and president of Language Mentor International, where he provides educational consultancy services to institutes higher education through the nation. He's also a native of Afghanistan and speaks both Dari and Pashto languages. In 2008, he developed one of the strongest Dari and Pashto programs in the country. And during that time at the Language Acquisition Resource Center in San Diego University, he taught intensive Dari and Pashto language and culture courses. Previously, Dr. Saydee worked as a refugee service provider at the IRC in San Diego, so he's pretty familiar with most of you who are doing this work. His role included resettlement case manager, job developer, and immigration case manager. I'm also thrilled to be introducing you to our very own Medina Masumi, who is a Switchboard training officer focusing on cultural awareness. She brings about 12 years of experience working as a licensed K-12 school counselor. As the daughter of Afghan refugees, Medina is also deeply familiar with the challenges of refugees integration. She holds a Master's of Education in School Counseling from George Mason University. With that, I'll get us through the learning objectives and hand it over. So the learning objective that we have for you today is for you to describe the key historical, political, and cultural experiences of Afghan newcomers. All right, and now on to the next of, there we go. As we start this training, we wanted to gauge your knowledge about Afghan history so that our speakers can kind of gauge in who is joining us. You should be able to take your phone and scan it, and or if you go to slido.com and enter in the code, you should be able to enter your questions and your answers to the question that we have for you. So, and I see lots of people answering, so I'll give it about 10 to 15 seconds and we'll go from there. Wonderful. I see lots of people answering, so I just want to give you all some time to do that. And then I'll hand it over to you, Farid, when you are ready. All right, I think this gives you a pretty good understanding of who is in our audience today, Dr. Farid.
Thank you, Tegest, and hello, everyone. It seems that we need a longer webinar to go through detailed information about the history, but this session will provide you some highlights about major historical events. So without any delay, let's get started. Afghanistan consists of diverse culture. The involvement of Persians, the Greeks, the Arabs, the Mongolians, the Mughals, the Pashtun tribes contributed significantly to the diversity of the country. Throughout the 1800s, Afghanistan's internal affairs were destabilized by intervention from British Empire and Tsarist Russia. After the Second Anglo-Afghan War, the British installed Abdurrahman, a member of Durrani Pashtun tribe, as Amir or ruler of Afghanistan. In 1893, the Durand Line Agreement was signed, dividing Afghanistan from the British colonial Indian subcontinent. The agreement made little consideration for ethnic groups who lived along the new border in a split Pashtun tribal areas between two different countries. The Durand Line has remained a point of great tension between Afghanistan and Pakistan since the establishment of Pakistan in 1947. The era of Abdurrahman was not without bloodshed. In his time, there were numerous uprisings. Many Hazaras, a minority Afghan group, were killed, and many more were forced to flee to Quetta, Pakistan. Their lands distributed among non-Hazaras. Abdurrahman Khan also reallocated many Ghilzai Pashtuns from the southern provinces to the north of the country. By doing this, he achieved two goals. First, he cleared himself of a rival Pashtun tribe who could challenge him in the south. Second, he created a force loyal to him in the north. While Ghilzais living in the south may have clashes with Durrani Pashtuns, Ghilzais in the north remained loyal to Durrani Pashtun government as they were surrounded by non-Pashtuns, including Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and Turkmens. In 1999, Afghanistan regained independence and experienced a period of stability, peace, and security. The country's first constitution was introduced in 1923. King Amanullah introduced social reforms, standardized taxes, and extended education. Among those reforms were women's rights and the option of showing face in public. Unfortunately, King Amanullah's domestic reforms and progressive thinking emboldened fanatic groups to overthrow the king. The king fled Afghanistan and spent the rest of his life in exile. Muhammad Zahir Shah was the last king of Afghanistan. In 1964, Zahir Shah developed a new constitution that lasted until 1973. Can we move to the next slide? With the support of the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, Dawood Khan staged a coup in 1973 against his cousin, King Mohammad Zahir Shah, and declared himself as the first president of Afghanistan. In 1978, the Soviet Union invasion launched the nation into an era of turmoil and civil war. During this time, the US supported and funded anti-communist freedom fighters, the Mujahideen. In 1992, the Soviet-backed government collapsed, creating a power vacuum that led to another civil war, which ended when the Taliban extremist group claimed control over the country in 1996. In response to September 11 attacks, the US and the European allies provided combat support in Afghanistan that helped to pave the way for a new provisional government. In the 20 years that followed, Afghanistan marched toward rebuilding as a stronger country. On August 15, 2021, the United States military officially withdrew from Afghanistan. Almost immediately, the Taliban advanced throughout the country and retook the nation's capital. Since then, the Taliban have reintroduced strict controls on personal freedoms and have curtailed 20 years of progress and development. The Taliban's campaign sparked a mass exodus, prompting the US and other international governments to carry out a rapid evacuation process. And with this, I give the floor to my colleague, Medina.
Thank you so much, Mr. Farid. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the themes in Afghan history. And these are themes that I'm sure you've most recently heard about a lot in the news with the recent events that have unfolded in the past year. So Afghanistan has a long history of war and violence. For generations this has been the case. And the Afghan people tend to pride themselves on never allowing their lands to be conquered, whether it was from the British invasion of the 1800s that Mr. Farid spoke about to the Soviet invasion of the 1970s. So Afghan people have a strong opposition to outside interference, and they tend to resist that. And to go along with that, they also have always had a history of a lot of interethnic tension. So part of the reason that a stable government is unable to form in Afghanistan is due to these interethnic tensions that exist between Pashtuns and Tajiks and Hazaras and Uzbeks. And it's been a long-standing part of the history of the country. We're going to go into this more in Module 3. So for today, I'll keep it to that point. The interesting thing is that Afghans do have a reputation to come together to defend the country against foreign interference. But when that's not an issue, then the interethnic tensions and civil wars remain an ongoing problem in the country. So displacement is another theme, obviously, and it's that factor that unites all the ethnicities and the tribal groups. They all have that in common, that they've all have shared experiences of displacement. Afghanistan has one of the world's largest refugee populations, and with every war and invasion that's occurred through the years, there's been new waves of Afghans who have been displaced. So it's really been going on for generations. And in the last 20 years, in terms of the education in Afghanistan, it did improve to some extent because the literacy rates rose to 43% in 2020. But overall, the education system has still remained ineffective because there's a lot of gaps in accessibility and resources, and the curriculum didn't provide enough critical thinking skills or 21st century skills. And currently, the situation is not good because the Taliban has once again denied girls the right to education beyond 6th grade. So that continues to be a big problem. Women's rights violations have been a theme in Afghan history. As you all may have heard from the most recent events that have unfolded in the past year, once again, a lot of women's rights have been taken away by the Taliban, such as I mentioned, the right to education or employment. Women are also now required again to cover from head to toe, and they have to be escorted by a male family member when they're in public. So this is it's a very sensitive and it's a traumatic event that's unfolded because it's sort of history repeating itself as it did in the 1990s. We can proceed to the next slide. So that leads me to talking about what is the current situation in Afghanistan. So the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan has escalated significantly since the Taliban have returned to power. The events that have unfolded in the past year have caused over 70,000 Afghans to be resettled in the United States, and almost over 200,000 Afghan refugees have fled to neighboring countries. The people who remain in Afghanistan are facing widespread food insecurity, loss of income, natural disasters, and acute malnutrition is also on the rise. 95% of households are reported to experience food insecurity. So it's a very big humanitarian crisis going on there right now. And obviously the situation that's happening in Afghanistan right now are affecting families who have migrated here to the US and abroad. Because many family members have connections or family that still remain in Afghanistan that they've been separated from in this resettlement process. We can proceed to the next slide.
Again, this is a very short opportunity for us to be sharing about the Afghan culture. We recognize that you might have a lot of questions that we hope to now use the rest of the time to answer. What questions do you have? And I just also put that in the chat for everyone to see. If you can use the Q&A question function that is located at the very lower part of your screen, we can field questions. And I think I see, let's see if we have any questions coming in, or I'll give it about maybe a 20 to 30 seconds to see that might come in. All right. Okay, there's a question here, and I don't know who, maybe for you, Farid. Can you talk a bit more about the literacy rate and how that impacts the communication we have in resettling?
Yes, I can start, and Medina can provide further input. So literacy rate was really low compared to the neighboring countries of Iran and Pakistan and other countries in the region in Afghanistan. But like Medina mentioned, in the last 20 years, the literacy rate went up. But again, the quality of education remains really ineffective, because the problem is that when we talk about literacy, so it is not about only reading and listening. It is about critical thinking, how to communicate with other people, how to see themselves as part of a global globalization or a member of a global community. These critical thinkings and 21st century skills that are needed for today's students, that is lacking in education in Afghanistan. And also another point that's, I think it's very important to mention about literacy and education in Afghanistan is that when the communist regime came to power, some people remained in Afghanistan, some people went to Iran and Pakistan, some to Western. So they had their education and they were exposed to different type of curriculum. For example, in refugee camps, Afghan refugees, they were exposed to a very extreme version of Islam and curriculum that was kind of like promoting violence at that time. And in Afghanistan and Kabul, especially in big cities under the communist regime, the curriculum was pro-communist and it was based on the concept that introduced by Marx. And then later on, when the democratic government came, supported by the United States, then curricula from Western countries exported to Afghanistan, which was not meeting the needs of Afghan students and Afghan society. And inside the classrooms, students were sitting together, but they had completely different mentalities. So the curriculum was not responsive to the needs of students as well as to the need of the country. So the illiteracy rate, the reading and writing, went up to a certain degree, but it was not effective. Medina, you want to add something?
Yes, sure. I'd like to add one thing to that. I think in terms of how it's going to affect the resettlement process here, it's important to note that there's really a mixed bag in terms of the education and literacy that students that you will receive have been exposed to. And it also really depends on what areas and parts of Afghanistan they're coming from. So generally speaking, citizens who lived in Kabul, which is the capital, as you guys are probably aware, have had better access to education. But if you were in more rural areas, especially certain rural areas that still weren't allowing girls to attend school, then that's something to keep in mind. Depending on what part of Afghanistan people are coming from, they definitely have different access to education. So it is going to be a mixed bag. I mean, there was even private schools in Afghanistan as of recently. So I think it's really important to know your clients and their families, and that gives you a better understanding, because it's not going to be necessarily just sort of one size fits all approach.
Great. Thank you both for this. And we have lots of questions, and probably more than the time that we have. One is, do the interethnic tensions have any relation to social class? And I'll note to say that we're actually going to be covering that in, I believe, module 3. So please come back and listen to that part. Maybe I'll say, let's keep the answers a little more brief so that we can get to as much questions. There's a question here that says, is the Taliban permitting humanitarian aid to enter country?
I think they based on what we hear in the media, they are welcoming, but the way that they want the humanitarian aid, that may not be acceptable to donors or helping countries, because they want to receive the aid and then they want to have full control of it. I think it's something that we hear from the news, so I'm not in that position to comment more on this.
Wonderful, thank you. There's a question around cultural, I think, assistance for, it says, because women had to be accompanied by men in Afghanistan, is that why it's a struggle to encourage women to go out on their own, like going to their children's doctor's appointments and other responsibilities that they might have?
Are we talking about Afghanistan or the United States?
Here, I think they're saying, is it based on their own experience back in Afghanistan that they're having some trouble sort of being on their own?
I don't think that it's a problem here in the United States, as long as families are getting a very comprehensive orientation on the culture of the United States, what is acceptable and not acceptable in this country, what's working or not working. So just to be accompanied by a man, that is something that's like a harsh policy that imposed by Taliban, and it's not supported by religion or by Afghan culture. So that's something that the interpretation of Taliban. But when families are coming here, now, as long as they know where to go, they know the address, they can communicate, and they know that how to work in this culture, I don't see any problem with that.
Wonderful.
And one thing that I want to add to it at the beginning, I think that the issue of gender is important, because if you have a female client, it's better to ask a female case manager to accompany that female, because of that gender issue. Then we will talk about it later on.
Got it.
Future
Thanks, Farid. There's a question here that says, how does the history of U.S. military in Afghanistan impact Afghans' perceptions of the U.S. feeling of living here? How can we be sensitive to this reality? I'm assuming service providers are asking on how to be sensitive to the history of U.S. military and then Afghanistan, and how that impacts Afghans' perception of them in the U.S.
That's a really good question. I can answer, and Farid, you can jump in if I leave something out. But I think that a good number of the Afghans coming into the U.S. were here from part of Operations Ally Welcome, right? So there are people who have supported the U.S. in some way who while they were in Afghanistan. And so I think overall, people who are here are looking for an opportunity for a better life for themselves and their families, and understand that the U.S. has wanted to support them in that sense. I think having said that, there are still people back in Afghanistan that might not necessarily feel that way, and it's important to be sensitive to that. But I think most people that are here are really grateful and happy that they have an opportunity to be here.
Any other additions that you might have? And I think what we'll do is I'll do one more question, a very quick one, and then I'll get us kind of complete since we have another session that we have to start. Okay, this is a good one, and maybe one for you, Medina. For refugees interested in continuing their education, how do people determine Afghan students' grade level? Decide whether to enroll in adult school or college? Or one for you, Farid.
I'm assuming this is for adult educators, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I'm sure that whatever, institution that they are seeking assistance in should have some type of an assessment to really gauge where they are in their education and learning. I know that even within like the school realm, if it's K through 12, they have tools to sort of gauge and monitor where somebody is in their learning. And I know that in adult education, especially with language services, they should have similar tools available. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. All right.
I also want to add quick things regarding education. Those individuals who come to this country and they have higher education or they have completed the universities in Afghanistan, most of universities, including Kabul University, public universities, and some private universities are recognized in the United States. So there is an agency that evaluate their degrees and transcripts as long as they provide official transcripts, and then they give them that what is equivalent of which grade of which year in the United States. Usually 4 years university in Afghanistan is equal to 4 years of university in the United States.
Great. Thank you both. And I, again, thank you so much for all your questions. We see them. We encourage you to look at the recommended resources that would hopefully also answer some of those questions. If you have some really burning questions, do feel free to email us, which will provide our email at the end. We've put together recommended resources, and the full list of that reference used for this webinar will be shared with you in the follow-up email by tomorrow. This is the learning objective that we had for you, and we hope that you have now been able to meet that. And finally, here is Switchboard's contact information, and I do hope that you'll stay in touch with us for future trainings and other resources that we will be sharing. And I also want to take this opportunity to say that we do have, for those who are accepted into the certificate portion of the course, please check your email for that link to the next session that will be starting shortly. And finally, I'm hoping that we can really get your feedback on this crash course that we put together for you. Depending on how you joined it, that link should also have popped up. The QR code is also another way for you to use and give us the survey feedback, which would be incredibly helpful for us so that we can use that to improve any future trainings that we have. Again, we thank you for the time that you've given us, and we hope to see you in the next session next week for Module 2 at the same time. And I will put the link in the survey link again in the chat for you all. If you haven't already, again, we encourage you to do that. with that, we'll go ahead and end the session right on time. Thank you so much.